All right, good afternoon and welcome to Global Communication 2. This is the class for Friday, October the 13th, 2023. Today we are going to be talking about a type of narrative called anecdotes. These are relatively short stories that we tell about experiences from our lives where we've learned some kind of lesson. Similar to a narrative essay, but more compact. If you watch any TED Talks, for example, a lot of TED Talks will start off, just bring the screen down a tiny bit. A lot of TED Talks will start off with an anecdote where the speaker will talk about an experience that they've had in their life, which is somewhat related to the topic that they're speaking about. It might demonstrate some kind of idea, or it might be an experience where the speaker learned some kind of important life lesson that they want to share with the audience. And because anecdotes are quite commonly found outside of the university environment, meaning you can find them in many different public presentations, as well as in conversation. People will sometimes give an anecdote if they're talking to somebody. You know, there was once this time when something happened to me. If they want to talk about an experience that demonstrates an idea or a time when they learned something important. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. Now, before you watch the rest of this lecture, what I'd like you to do is stop it for a moment and watch this YouTube video by a man called Mark Green. The title of the TED Talk is How to Talk Like a Native Speaker. Mark Green speaks a number of different languages. He speaks them very fluently, and he has some advice on how people that want to speak a foreign language as well as a native speaker can do so. So what I'd like you to do is turn off this lecture for a moment, go to YouTube, click on the link. Actually, I guess you can't click on, well, actually you can click on the link. I'll be uploading this PowerPoint to CyberCampus. So click on the link. So if you go to CyberCampus announcements, class 12 anecdotes, get this PPT, click on the link, or just go to YouTube and put in Mark Green TED Talk, How to Talk Like a Native Speaker, and watch the video. Now, you don't have to watch the whole video. As I recall, the whole video is about 20 minutes long. I'm not interested in the whole video. I would like you to watch the first few minutes, because it's the first few minutes of the video when Mark gives an anecdote. He talks about an experience that he had as a young person when he learned the importance of learning a foreign language or foreign languages. You know, wherever you go, it's important to be able to speak the language, at least a little bit. And he has an interesting anecdote about a time when he was a young man on his first trip to Russia. So watch the first few minutes of the video, and I want you to think about these questions. What experience does he describe? How does it relate to the topic? And what is your opinion of the anecdote? Do you think it's interesting? Did it make the point that the speaker wanted? Do you think it was too long? Do you think it was too short? How about his delivery? Did he speak slowly enough for everyone to understand? Did he connect with the audience, which is always an important thing when you're giving a presentation, connecting with the audience? Is there anything that you would change about the anecdote? Or do you think the anecdote was pretty well done? Do you think that it was effective and conveyed the point that the speaker wanted to make? So do that now. Turn off this lecture for a minute. Go watch the first few minutes of Mark Green's speech, where he gives an anecdote about his first trip to Russia and the importance of learning a foreign language. And then I'll see you after. Okay, so I'll assume that you have watched the video, and if you haven't, I'll find out. Okay, so moving on. Yeah, anecdotes. An anecdote, like I mentioned before, is a short narrative, meaning it's a short story, usually true, actually always true, that's the whole point. A true story about an interesting event that happened in someone's life. Usually they are autobiographical, meaning people will talk about experiences that they have had that demonstrated an idea or illustrated a life lesson. And yeah, although it is possible to give an anecdote from a friend's life or a family member's life, usually people talk about experiences that they've had personally. Today, we're going to look at the anecdote as a 2-paragraph narrative. So very short. You don't have necessarily the beginning, middle, and end. You have paragraph 1, which is the setup, and then paragraph 2, which is the payoff. The first paragraph will give us all the background information that we need and then get the story going. The second paragraph is going to give us the main event or the point of the story. And then the second paragraph will conclude with the life lesson, which is the point that the writer or the speaker wants to make. So short, interesting events, has to be short, able to be told in a very limited number of words. It should be interesting, something that people will enjoy listening to. It should be something from your life. And because it's such a short narrative, just 2 paragraphs, you're going to arrange the events chronologically. There's no mixed up sequence of events here. You start at the beginning, you finish at the end. A, B, C, and that's it. Okay, so let's take a look. Yeah, the 2-paragraph anecdote structure. Your anecdote should answer the following questions. When and where did the event take place? Who was involved? What happened? Why did it happen? What was the result? And what was the lesson that you learned? That's an awful lot of information to convey in just 2 paragraphs. Not only that, but some of this information you need to get in the first couple of sentences. Now, you might recall from our last class, we looked at the A&P, or the summary of the A&P story by John Updike. And one of the questions that I asked you was, what information is given in the first 2 sentences? And in those first 2 sentences, we are introduced to the main characters. So we get Queenie and the girls entering the store. We get Sammy. We also get the location. It takes place in a small New England town, specifically in a grocery store. That's what you need to do in the beginning of an anecdote too. Those first couple of sentences are like an anchor. They have to hook us into the story and give us the basic information that we need to continue. Remember, an anecdote is short. You don't have any time to waste. So in the very beginning of the anecdote, the first couple of sentences, you should tell me when and where it took place and who was involved. After that, later in the first paragraph, you might talk about what happened. And then you'll move on to the main event, which will be the important thing that happened. And then towards the end of the second paragraph, you tell us what the result was, and then you'll discuss or you'll mention what life lesson or what interesting idea you came to understand. So let's take a look at my first model anecdote here and see how what I said about putting a lot of information in the first couple of sentences and having the setup in the first paragraph and the payoff in the second paragraph. Let's see how that all works out. Let me just take a quick sip of water here. Okay, one summer weekend, some friends and I decided to walk to a waterfall that we had heard about. Since it was too far to walk along the road, we followed a railroad line. We had walked 5 or 6 miles when we came to a high rock wall where the tracks entered a tunnel. The tunnel didn't look very long, but it was very narrow, and we knew it would be dangerous if a train came. because there would be no safe place for us to go. However, we couldn't climb the rocks or walk around them, and no one wanted to go back. Finally, we decided to go through the tunnel. I knew it was foolish, but I went because the others did. Now, take a look at the first two sentences of this paragraph. One summer weekend, some friends and I decided to walk to a waterfall that we had heard about. Since it was too far to walk along the road, we followed a railroad line. Now, these two sentences are great because they're very concise and they tell us just enough for us to understand what is going to happen in the story. So we get the when. When did this happen? One summer weekend. Who was involved? Who are going to be the characters in this anecdote? Some friends and I. Okay, well, what did you guys do? Well, we decided to walk. Where did you decide to walk? To a waterfall we had heard about. And why? What's the purpose? Well, it was too far to walk along the road, so we followed a railroad line. In two sentences, we get when, who, what, where, and why. Not a single word is wasted. As I mentioned before, an anecdote is a very, very condensed form of narrative. It's not a novel. You have to give as much information as you possibly can in as short a space as you possibly can. All right, let's take a look at the second paragraph now. As soon as we entered the tunnel, we saw that it was longer and darker than we had thought. Suddenly, everyone was frightened, and we all began to run. This is crazy, I thought. As we ran faster, it got lighter in the tunnel. Once we were outside, we fell on the ground, gasping. Gasping, so breathing in a somewhat stressed manner, out of breath. About a minute later, a train came through, and that was when I finally realized the importance of thinking for myself. Now, this line in red at the end of the second paragraph, that was when I finally realized the importance of thinking for myself. This is connected to the final line of the first paragraph. If I go back just for a second, take a look at that last line of the first paragraph. I knew it was foolish, but I went because the others did. I knew it was dangerous to go into the tunnel, but I went because I just wanted to follow my friends. And then at the end of the anecdote, that's when the writer says, that's when I learned the importance of thinking for myself. Now, you might not have noticed this, but that last sentence of the first paragraph is a setup. We don't know what's going to happen in the second paragraph, but the writer sets it up. I knew it was a bad idea, but I went anyway. And then we get the payoff in the second paragraph. Train comes through after they come out of the tunnel, and they're quite scared, and they realize how close they came to disaster. And then the writer realizes that they shouldn't have done what they did. They shouldn't have just followed their friends because everyone else was doing something. Now, I want to stop here for a moment to talk about the past perfect tense. You might remember in our previous class when I was talking about the narrative essay, My Mother's China Cups, I talked about the past perfect tense. I'd like to mention that past perfect tense again and give it a little bit more detail. The past perfect tense is formed by using had plus the past participle, or PP. It's sometimes called the past tense, and that's because it's used to describe something that happened before something else in the narrative. So rather than just going from the furthest back in the narrative and then slowly coming towards the present, sometimes we want to mention two things that happened, sometimes even in the same sentence, and we might put the more recent one first or the later one first, and then you need to use the past perfect in order to distinguish between these two. Let's take a look. We had walked 5 or 6 miles when we came to a high rock wall. So in this case, we have two actions, walking for 5 or 6 miles and coming to a high rock wall. Well, what happened first? Obviously walking. So they walked for 5 or 6 miles and then they came to a high rock wall. In order to make it clear that walking happened first, we can use the past perfect tense. So we had walked for 5 or 6 miles when we came to a high rock wall. If you wanted to, you could even switch the order of these events and it would still be fine. You know, we came to a high rock wall after we had walked 5 or 6 miles. So if you use the past perfect tense in conjunction with the past tense, we don't need to be confused about which event happened first. It just makes it clear. Here's another couple of examples. Some friends and I decided to walk to a waterfall. Let's move this over here. There we go. Some friends and I decided to walk to a waterfall that we had heard about. Okay, so the first thing is, if you actually think about it chronologically, first they heard about this waterfall. After they heard about the waterfall, they decided to walk there. So I decided to walk to a waterfall that we had heard about. They heard about it first, and then they decided to walk there. And then another example, we saw it was longer and darker than we had thought. Well, before they went to the tunnel, or before they went into the tunnel, they didn't think it was very long. They didn't think it was very dark. But after that, they discovered that their earlier impression, their earlier assumption was wrong. It was longer and darker than we had thought. They don't think that now. Now they have gone into the tunnel. They saw it, saw, past tense of see. Had thought, okay, that's the earlier event. Okay, moving on. There we go. All right, so inserting the life lesson. Now, one thing that often happens in an anecdote is the writer does something that is ill-advised. They make a poor choice. They make some kind of mistake. Mark Green's anecdote about getting lost on the subway in Moscow, you know, and writing down the word in Russian for bathroom rather than writing down the name of the subway station. That's a very clear example of somebody that has made a mistake. And then that mistake actually becomes very apparent later in the anecdote. Once again, set up and pay off. He sets up the situation by saying that he thought it was a good idea to bring his notebook, and he wrote down what he thought was the subway station. And then later on, it turns out that he was mistaken. And from this, he learned the importance of understanding a foreign language when traveling. Well, the life lesson in this case is somewhat different. In this case, the narrator does the opposite of what they should do. And it's not an honest mistake. You know, for example, in the anecdote about getting lost on the Moscow subway, subway, he just didn't know any better. He wasn't familiar with the Russian alphabet. But in this anecdote about going into the train tunnel, actually the narrator did the opposite of what they should do. And actually in their heart, they knew that they were making a mistake. They knew they were doing something dangerous, but they did it anyway. And you can see that at the end of the first paragraph. I knew it was foolish, but I went because the others did. And that sets up the life lesson, which we get at the end of the second paragraph. That's when I finally realized the importance of thinking for myself. Okay, moving on. Okay, there we are. All right, now here's a brief list of life lessons that often come up in anecdotes. This is not an exhaustive list, So there are many life lessons or ideas that can come up in an anecdote, that are not on this list. These are just some basic examples. Like, it's important to think for yourself, independent thinking, not following the crowd, not being a sheep. Self-discipline is important if you want to succeed. Earlier in this course, we looked at role models and successful people. One of the most common characteristics of a successful person is the ability to have discipline, to discipline oneself. Self-discipline is important. And there are many anecdotes, I'm sure, from whether it's Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, Sandra Banks, Oprah Winfrey, or many other successful people who would tell you some story from their life that demonstrates the importance of self-discipline, or the importance of taking a risk. Maybe you have to take a risk in order to get what you want. Nothing worth having is going to come to you if you're not willing to lose something. So sometimes you have to take risks. Or the importance of keeping your promise. And if you're not able to keep a promise, maybe you shouldn't make a promise. You should never make promises you can't keep, or you should never lie to the people you love. Hard work can be really satisfying. Change is the only thing that is certain in life. Friendship, the value of friendship, or the value of compromise, or even sometimes parents actually knowing better than you do. These are all things which can come up as a life lesson in an anecdote. There are many, many more. This is just a short list. Okay, all right. Now, if you are going to write an anecdote, you're going to tell a story about something that happened in your life, one of the most important things to do is to stay on topic. And this is probably the most common mistake that people make when they're writing a narrative essay, or when they're writing an anecdote, or talking to anybody about anything. This can even happen in a job interview. It's death in a job interview if you do this. Avoid digressions. Stay on topic. A digression is when someone goes off on a tangent. They leave the main point and they go off on some detail that might seem very interesting, but is not clearly related to the main idea or central theme of their anecdote or their longer narrative. And because people tend to think that all of the details in their story are important, it's very easy to forget that what's important to you might not be important to the person who is listening to your story, or reading your anecdote, or reading your speech, whatever it may be. So the important thing to do is always think, what is important to understanding the narrative? If it's important, then you keep it. And if it's not, you got to trim the fat. Okay, let's take a look at an example here. So one summer weekend, some friends and I decided to walk to a waterfall that we had heard about. This waterfall was called Horsetail Falls because it looked like a horse's tail. Many of the lakes and mountains in the area were named for things that they looked like. There was also Camel Humps Mountain and Elephant Ear Lake. There was a place to swim at the bottom, and it was a wonderful place for a picnic. We had never been there before because it was on the other side of the mountain. It was several miles by road, and none of us could drive yet. All of our parents worked, and there was no bus service. However, we knew that it was shorter if you didn't take the road and just walked over the mountain. Okay, so this is the first paragraph. If this was a short story or a longer narrative essay, including this amount of detail would be fine. There's some interesting stuff here, you get the idea of this area where there's these interesting places you can visit that have interesting names. But this is not a longer narrative. This is not a short story. This is not a biography. This is just a short 2-paragraph anecdote. And in that case, we have to make some cuts. Now, take a look here. I've decided to highlight different parts that I think are more or less interesting. one summer weekend, some friends and I decided to walk to a waterfall we had heard about. Okay, that's important. We know the when, we know the who, we know the why, and we know the where. This waterfall was called Horsetail Falls because it looked like a horse's tail. Probably not important. Many of the lakes in the area were named for things they looked like. There was also Camel Humps Mountain and Elephant Ear Lake. Really not important. And I'll tell you why it's not important in just a moment. After that, there was a place at the bottom, and it was a wonderful place for a picnic. We had never been there before because it was on the other side of the mountain. It was several miles by road, and none of us could drive yet. All of our parents worked, and there was no bus service. Now, a couple of those sentences, there was a place to swim at the bottom, and it was a wonderful place for a picnic. You could argue that that information is important because it does tell us why they want to go to this waterfall. Great place, had a great place to swim at the bottom. It was a wonderful place for a picnic. All of our parents worked and there was no bus service. That does explain why they were walking. However, we knew it was shorter if you didn't take the road and just walked over the mountain. That sentence at the end of the first paragraph is what is going to set up the main event of this anecdote. And this is where you'll see that most of the information in the introduction is not important. Okay, let's take a look at this now with some information removed. One summer weekend, some friends and I decided to walk to a waterfall we had heard about. There was a place to swim at the bottom, and it was a wonderful place for a picnic. We'd never been there before because it was on the other side of the mountain. It was several miles by road, and none of us could drive yet. However, we knew that it was shorter if you didn't take the road and just walked over the mountain. Now, make it even shorter. One summer weekend, some friends and I decided to walk to a waterfall that we had heard about. We had never been there before because it was on the other side of the mountain. It was several miles by road, and none of us could drive yet. However, we knew that it was shorter if you didn't take the road and just walked over the mountain. Okay, now the important thing to remember, that first paragraph is not the main event. It's just setting up the main event. Some friends and I decided to go to a waterfall. It sounded like a very great place. It was far away. None of us could drive. And we decided to take a shortcut by walking over the mountain. That really is all we need to know, because the main event is what's going to happen on that mountain. Okay, it was too far by road, so they're like, let's go over the mountain. This is a classic setup because something obviously happened on the way to the waterfall. The waterfall itself is not important. That's just the distant goal. You know that something happened on the way, and whatever it was, it's not really important. Maybe someone fell off a cliff. Maybe someone got eaten by a wild animal. Who knows? Maybe there was a tiger that escaped from the zoo. Maybe there was an alien spaceship. Whatever it was, the person didn't reveal it before paragraph 2, so there's no spoilers, but you get the sense from that setup at the end of the first paragraph, something is going to happen on the way to the waterfall as they walk over the mountain in paragraph 2. Okay, and now here is my second example. By the way, this is going to lead into your third homework assignment, so please pay attention. The year I turned 15, my parents sent me to work on my uncle's farm for the summer. It was in South Carolina, and they had peach trees, cows, and chickens. They didn't make much money, and my father was always telling my uncle to sell the farm and move to Chicago. I didn't want to go to the farm, and I didn't like it when I got there. My cousins got up every morning at 4:30, and they went to bed at 9 o'clock at night. In between, they worked. I had never worked on a farm before, so my cousin Wayne had to teach me how to do everything, like milking the cows, driving the tractor, and so on. We were the same age, but I was bigger than he was. I was already 6 feet tall. Even so, I couldn't do anything as well as he could. I had a lot of friends at home, and we always hung around together, especially in the summer. I used to think about them. They don't need to work on some stupid farm, I thought. Why do I have to? Okay, now, if we were doing this in class and not on Zoom, this is where I would divide you into groups and ask you and your partners to take a look at this anecdote, at least the first paragraph, and then decide what information is not necessary. How many digressions can you find? Remember, if something's not 100% important to the story, then you have to make a decision. Are you going to keep it or are you going to cut it? Also, what happens next? Depending on what the life lesson is, obviously what's going to count as important information will be different. I think from this first paragraph, the life lesson that the writer wants to share is fairly obvious. I will let you try and figure out what it is. It's one of them. I would say it is one of the life lessons that I mentioned on the list of life lessons earlier in the lecture. However, we are not in class today because this is a Zoom lecture. So I'm going to put this as your third homework assignment. What I would like you to do is edit the paragraph. So on Cyber Campus, I have uploaded an MS Word file that has the original paragraph, and I would like you to edit it. So take a look and decide what information is important, what information is not important. Remember, if it's an unnecessary detail, you got to cut it. And then I want you to write a second paragraph that completes the anecdote. Remember, the life lesson should be put at the end of the second paragraph. And regardless of which life lesson you choose, it has to make sense. If I read the first paragraph and then I read your second paragraph and the life lesson comes at the end of the second paragraph, there has to be a setup and a payoff. I have to understand, this is what the person learned. It has to make sense from the context of the first paragraph. The first paragraph sets it up. The second paragraph is the payoff. Okay, so whatever life lesson you choose, and I think it's fairly obvious what the life lesson is here, considering the person didn't enjoy the working on the farm at first in the summer. I think it's fairly obvious, but I think I'll let you choose. I'm not going to state it. So edit the paragraph and then write a second paragraph that completes the anecdote. Insert the life lesson at the end. I'm looking for a total of 400 to 450 words. And that's for the first paragraph and the second paragraph combined. So total of 400, 450 words, no more. The due date will be 11:59 p.m. Friday, October 20th. Please put a title and a word count and include your name you don't need to include your name and student number. Also, don't upload a Word file. Just copy and paste it into the text box on Cyber Campus announcements. Do not upload a separate file. Just copy and paste into the text box. That's all you need to do. Okay, if you have any questions about today's lesson regarding anecdotes, or if you have any questions about the homework assignment, please put your question into the group chat on Sagang Talk Talk, and I will see everybody in class next Wednesday for our next regularly scheduled class. So have a great weekend. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and I'll see everybody next week. Okay, bye-bye.